Bay, the unceded ancestral territory, which remains the homeland of the Mi'kmaq Nation. This territory is covered by the covenant chain of treaties of peace and friendship signed between 1725 and 1779. These treaties are affirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada and are living agreements that establish the rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. We pay respect to the knowledge embedded in the Mi'kmaq custodians of the lands and waters and to the elders past, present, and future. We also would like to acknowledge the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people who have been here for over 400 years. Thank you all for joining us today. The Black and Indigenous, the purpose of this Black and Indigenous speaker series is to highlight the work of Black and Indigenous scholars, share their worldviews, and initiate important conversations around that. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Eric Oliver. I'm going to disclose that I know Eric very well. As of Wednesday this week, we've been married for 14 years. One of his achievements. But I'm going to be brief. So, Eric was born and grew up in Labrador. He learned about the Inuit traditional ways of knowing from his father and his family and his extended family and his community. His mother is actually an alumni of the Mount. She is a teacher, then moved to Labrador to work there and stayed and formed a family in Labrador. So Eric was always interested in the natural world, and when he finished his high school, he came to Nova Scotia to study physics and mathematics at Acadia, then moved to Ottawa to do his master's in physics, then came back to Nova Scotia to complete a PhD in physical oceanography at Dalhousie. Then his postdoctoral work was focused on marine heat waves, so that are extreme climate events that are influenced by climate change. And today is International Day of Climate Action, so we invited Eric to raise awareness and inspire climate action as well. Even when Eric was in Australia, he's always it's been important for him to travel to Labrador and, in his words, to recharge, but also keeping the connections with his family and his community in Rigolet in Labrador. So when he came back to Nova Scotia as a faculty member at Dalhousie, he joined the Oceanography department there. He saw this as an opportunity to work with his community in Labrador. So he's going to talk about that today. But finally, I want to mention a couple of recognitions for Eric that he doesn't share very much, but I like to show off. So Eric last year was one of 3 researchers at Dal that were included in the Clarivate. This is a prestigious list of highly cited researchers globally. And also in 2023, he received an Inuit Recognition Award from the ITK. This is the national organization that advances the rights of Inuit people nationally. And so the award is a recognition to an Inuk who is committed to meaningful Inuit involvement in Arctic research. So over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Ceci. And thank you for the invitation to come and speak. I'm very happy to be here. So yes, I'm going to speak on some aspects of the work I've been doing in the last 7 or 8 years on this topic of working with both scientific and Inuit knowledge of the ocean and sea ice. And I'm going to start a timer because I think I have more content than we can fit in an hour. So I want to make sure I abbreviate it correctly. Okay, so who am I? Cecilia gave you a nice introduction there. I'm considering this as like a positionality statement. Positionality is something that's common in social sciences, but it's really not very common in the natural sciences, which is the field that I work in. It's a statement. It's a way for a researcher to position themselves with respect to their research in terms of their identity, their beliefs, and their privilege. And for this work that I'll speak about today, it makes sense for me to have a positionality statement. So first, as you heard, I'm a husband. I'm a father. That's our daughter there on the right, Coral. She's 9 years old. I'm an academic and I'm Inuit. As an academic, I'm trained in the natural sciences as a physical oceanographer. As an individual, I come from Labrador. My roots are in Nunatsiavut, which is, we'll talk more about that in a second. I grew up there and just outside the region. I'm Inuit from my father's side of the family, from Tikkoraluk Island and Rocky Cove, and that's how I was raised. My other half of my family is settler Canadian living across southern Canada. Roots are in Lunenburg County, Nova Scotia. And so I feel I'm often able to understand both the Inuit and the settler sides of many topics, or at least enough that I can play what I think of as my superpower as a way of sitting between those worlds and translating and facilitating those conversations. So I believe that science is a really powerful tool for understanding the world, and I've had great mentors all through my training. I've also learned from members in my community in Nunatsiavut and have experienced firsthand the depth of knowledge held by Inuit about the environment. And so I believe both that scientific knowledge and Inuit knowledge can be used together to provide a joint understanding of our world. And hopefully you'll see that throughout today. So the research topics I'll discuss today are sometimes quite personal, and I'll weave together the threads of my own story, as you'll see. So I mentioned Nunatsiavut. So this is a map of Inuit Nunangat, which if you're not familiar what it is, it's the 4 Inuit regions in Canada. I'm sure you know of Nunavut, the territory of Nunavut. There are 3 others. They have various states of self-governance. So Nunatsiavut is the eastern and southernmost one. It's the northern part of Labrador in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. I also want to point out that that's within Canada. These form part of a larger set of Inuit regions across internationally, which would also include Kalaalleq Nunaat in Greenland, the northern and western parts of Alaska, and parts of coastal Siberia. And all of those regions interact together as part of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. So if you look at that map, and then look at this map, which is a map of average February sea ice coverage in the Northern Hemisphere, there's very much a correspondence between where there's sea ice and what are Inuit regions, except for the Arctic coast of Eurasia. So that highlights the critical importance of Inuit culture to sea ice, or rather of sea ice to Inuit culture. It's extremely important. And that will come back several times throughout this talk. The next panel on the right there shows the changes in sea ice over the last several decades. And so you can see significant changes. Do I have a pointer? Significant decreases in sea ice in the southernmost ends of that sea ice distribution. And that is putting significant stress on the communities that live in those areas that rely on the sea ice, because it's significant changes to what is essentially critical infrastructure for how people travel on the land. And it is also affecting how people travel safely on the land, because there's traditional ways of knowing how to travel safely on the sea ice and how to travel when sea ice is unsafe. But under climate change, some of those traditional ways of knowing are becoming unreliable. And so one of the things I'm working on is trying to complement those traditional ways of knowing with scientific ways of understanding sea ice stability, sea ice growth and melt and travel safety. So the map on the left there shows you the outline of Labrador, and the colored portion would be Nunatsiavut. So a bit of a history. In 1973, the Labrador Inuit Association was created to represent Labrador Inuit at a time when similar organizations were being created across Canada and the US. In 1977, a land claim was filed by the LAA for this region. I'll come back to that in a second. In 2005, that was settled and the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement was signed, which led to the creation of the Nunatsiavut government with the bounds that you see here on the map. So there are about 2,500 Inuit that live within this region. There are 5 communities: Rigolet, which is the area where my family's from, Cove, Postal, Hopedale, and Nain. And then there's an additional 5,000 that live outside that region, half of which in the Upper Lake Melville area, which is where I grew up, and the other half across the rest of Canada and the world, which is where I live now. In 2011, the Nunatsiavut Research Center was formed, which is a physical infrastructure based in Nain to support research in the region. And as part of that, the Nunatsiavut Government Research Advisory Council was formed. This is a body that governs anyone who wishes to do research in the region, liaises with this organization, and it helps advise people on how to do research, what they should or shouldn't be doing to ensure that the research is in the best interests of Labrador Inuit, and how to incorporate Inuit knowledge and make sure that locals are employed and so on in that process. In 2017, NG, so when I say NG, it's Nunatsiavut government, started developing its marine plan called MSVU, which means Our Oceans, essentially implementing Chapter 6 of the Land Claims Agreement around ocean planning. So a responsibility of the Nunatsiavut government is to implement this. And in 2025, NG released its climate change strategy. And so I list these things to show you what is the history of the context of Inuit sovereignty, governance and policy around the ocean, and connection to research. And so my work kind of fit into that context. So I want to tell a couple stories that fit in to this timeline as well. So in 1977, as I said, the Labrador Inuit Association filed a land claim for part of what is Labrador on behalf of Labrador Inuit. Canada and the province of Newfoundland responded, I will figuratively paraphrase by saying, prove it, meaning prove that this is your land. To the Inuit, this was obvious, but to Canada and Newfoundland, it was not. So the unspoken footnote of that statement, prove it, means, well, it needs to be proof that we understand. It needs to be proof that will hold in a Canadian court, Canadian courts being the product of colonial Western history and culture. And so Labrador Inuit embarked on a process of documenting use and occupancy in Northern Labrador, making extensive use of maps and interviews with Inuit all along the coast. And this study is published as Our Footprints Are Everywhere, just shown here at the bottom. That's an example map, which is foundational to the settlement of the Nunatsiavut land claim. Now, importantly, I want to make the point that this study and its effect on the land claim did not change perspectives by Labrador Inuit about our own relationship to the land. Rather, it documented that relationship in a manner that a language that the courts could understand. So it was a way of communicating, essentially. Now, fast forward to 2018, story about me. I was attending the CMOS, Canadian Meteorology and Oceanography Society annual meeting. I was sitting at a table with a senior colleague during one of the sessions, and I was describing an idea that I had about how a numerical ocean model, so that would be like a weather model for the ocean, a way of simulating the physics of the ocean and predicting the ocean state, how we could validate that kind of model. When we have a model like that, we need to test it against observations to tell us, does this model make any sense? Is it useful? That we could validate such model using local Indigenous knowledge as an alternative to seeking out, or in addition to seeking out, scientific observations. The response from my colleague was a flat and dismissive, well, that's not real data. And that comment was made not to open a dialogue around, well, what is the nature of Indigenous knowledge, but rather it was, that's not good science. And at the time, the comment upset me, it bothered me, but I've come to interpret it in a manner similar to how the courts in Canada and Newfoundland responded to the LIA land claim submission, which is essentially prove it, put this in a language that we can exchange and understand. And so that's kind of guided my thinking about how I've gone about my work in engaging with Inuit knowledge of the ocean and the sea ice. So a bit of geographic context. So this is a portion of the coast of Labrador. It's about 400 kilometers from end to end. 4 of the 5 communities in Nunatsiavut are within this map. You'll struggle to find them. You'll struggle to find any roads. There are no roads connecting the communities. They're connected by aircraft, and seasonally there's a ferry that connects the communities, but that kind of travel is quite expensive. You can see the coastline is very complex. It's punctuated by these long, narrow, indented bays and an archipelago of hundreds, if not probably thousands, of islands. This is what it looks like in September, I think. September during the open water season. And if we fast forward about 6 months, this is what it looks like in February. So it is now, that coastal zone is now covered with this fixed sheet of ice, kind of just inside all of the islands. That will be the landfast ice. So that's about a meter-ish thick sheet of sea ice that is immobile. And then the edge of it, called the Chenal, separates it from the mobile pack ice in open water. So inside that, it essentially acts as an extension of the land and also facilitates travel and connection between communities. So this is a point that's not always obvious to people that haven't grown up around sea ice, but when the ice is frozen, it's easier to travel than when the ice is not frozen. And so during this season is when people are connected, are able to share culture, are able to access hunting and fishing places, are able to access ancestral homes much more easily. And sea ice is often expressed, I've heard it independently said this way by multiple people, sea ice is our freedom. It liberates people from being stuck in community, which is often the case in late fall when you're in this stage where ice is freezing and it's difficult to travel. So it's very important for people. So in the talk today, I'm going to talk about different kinds of knowledge and translating across knowledge systems. So it's useful to define some of these terms. I want to just say that these are definitions that I'm working with that I find useful. They may not be definitions that everybody agrees on, but it'll sort of set the foundation for the rest of the talk. So there's 4 things I want to define. Knowledge. So knowledge is a familiarity, awareness, or understanding of someone or something, such as facts, skills, or objects, and it can be acquired in many different ways and from many different sources. Science is a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about our environment. Scientific observations of the environment, along with theories about how it functions, together provides scientific knowledge. Now, Inuit knowledge encompasses both traditional knowledge, so multi-generational knowledge held by Inuit, and contemporary observations. Traditional knowledge is held by the community. It's inherently a multi-generational form of knowledge rooted in culture and rooted in practice in place, practice by Inuit in a particular place. On the other hand, contemporary experiential observations are based on the narratives, anecdotes, comments, stories of Inuit reflecting on the present day. And knowledge co-production probably has as many definitions as people who use the term. For my purposes, I'll define knowledge co-production as the process of iteratively bringing together multiple ways of knowing and acting, such as including Inuit knowledge and scientific knowledge, to holistically understand, address, and identify solutions to a specific problem. And the specific problem that's arching over the work that I'm involved in, and it's a very general problem, is to understand the marine and sea ice environment around coastal Nunatsiavut. In particular, how can we better predict it and understand potential future change, ideally to feed into management and policy decisions that would be undertaken by the Nunatsiavut government and other government bodies. So, in 2020, the Sustainable Nunatsiavut Futures Project, this logo here, was created, was funded to undertake research that fits within that broad problem that I just defined. So the 2 main goals of that project that have evolved over time, and the way I would articulate them today, are to undertake research on the coastal environment in order to generate data and information on that environment to better inform policy and management of it by the Nunatsiavut government, and to undertake partnered research where that partnership operates across academia, across disciplines in academia, and also between academia and communities in Nunatsiavut. And in order to develop new and better ways of doing that kind of partnered research, to try to change the way research is done, what you might call it decolonized research. We don't use that term, but it fits in that way of thinking. So this project is a partnership between Dalhousie University, the Nunatsiavut government, and Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. So the project was started in 2020. It's finishing in spring of 2026, so it's active at the moment. As part of the project, it has positions that are referred to as Inuit research coordinators. So these are full-time positions paid out of the academic institutions from the project funds, and they're based in communities. And those individuals, there have been up to 4 or 5 at a time. Right now we have 2. Those individuals, their role is to work with all aspects of the project. This is a huge project. It's probably 12 PIs, 2 universities, $4 million over 6 years. So you can imagine how expansive it can be. Those individuals are working across all aspects of the project, just trying to connect people, just trying to always maintain community connection and community voices in the project. And the very first research coordinator is Chaim Anderson. She's an amazing woman. She came on in 2020. March of 2020, so full COVID, right? All of our meetings with her were held. I was in my basement office, and Sue Ziegler, who was a co-PI, was in her home, and Chaim was in her home. Chaim has actually gone on after working on this project to be an employee of the Nunatsiavut Research Center, and also led the NG climate change strategy that I mentioned before, and now she works for NG's infrastructure department. She cares very deeply about her community and bringing what's best to her community. Maine is her community, the northernmost community. And she was very motivated by the goals of this project, and it was so vague and aspirational. We didn't even really know where to start and how to structure doing this kind of work. That was really, let's do science differently, but we didn't have any structure around that. And she reflects how at the time she spent 3 days in her office, and she had slips of paper with all the different parts of the project and how we wanted to do things, and she arranged it on the floor of her office and coming up with how we could think about this project. And she brought it to Sue and I, and together we all talked about it and developed this diagram that you see here, which is the research paradigm for how we've been thinking about our component of the project, which is one of the 4 work packages in the project. And we also developed these guiding principles that I won't get into today. I want to focus on this. So you'll see in this diagram 3 overlapping bubbles representing the past, the present, and the future. And in the past and the present bubbles, we have lines 1, 2, and 3 for the role that science can play, the role that Inuit knowledge can play, and something around the process, thinking about the process of doing this work. So in the past, for example, we have from science, we have existing scientific data, measurements, existing scientific knowledge from publications that we should draw from. From Inuit knowledge, we can record or refer to existing recordings or liaise with knowledge holders on Inuit knowledge. And in terms of the process, we should learn from other similar groups that have done or are embarking on doing similar kinds of work. In the present day, scientifically, we can measure, in this case, the ocean and the ice with scientific instruments. From the Inuit perspective, we can document Inuit observations and experiences about the environment in their own words. And in terms of the process, we should work on building and implementing this community-based plan for research in order to move to the future, which is really to have this long-term research program where we're monitoring identified indicators of change, like what are aspects of the ecosystem that we should be monitoring that are key indicators of climate change for local communities. Can we predict change and ensure that the program is community-based with broad support? And then we have this overlapping areas around ensuring that data is shared, identifying those indicators, and learning and changing, which is really reflecting on how we're doing the work. And is it ethical? Is it right? Do we need to change? Especially from the academic perspective, we're sitting in these institutions that have a lot of momentum and ways of doing things that might be at odds with working ethically with communities. And so how do we need to change that in order to be doing the work ethically? So for the rest of the talk, I have 4 examples that fit from different parts. This recorded Inuit knowledge from the past, Inuit observations from the present, scientific monitoring from the present, and learning and changing. And we'll see, I may have to abbreviate it to 3 depending on the time. We'll start with the first example around documenting Inuit knowledge. So this comes from the community-based observations of Nunatsiavut Ocean Circulation, or CONUC project, which actually started before the SNF project and then ran into it and overlapped a lot with it. And I want to recognize Claudio Porta, who is a former professor at Dalhousie University. He's an anthropologist, and he studied Inuit mobility in the Arctic. So this is an example of the kind of outputs from his work, which is mapping trails that you would use over the landscape, and how they experience the environment while traveling on the land. And while he was describing his method, which involves very large maps, having community members mark directly on the maps where their travel routes are, it occurred to me that just having people mark travel routes is missing a lot of the contextual information, that knowledge that people would have that is related to why the travel routes are where they are. It's not just geographic, but there's knowledge there about ice conditions, about ocean conditions. There are environmental reasons why people travel in certain ways and not in other ways. And so we developed this project to document Inuit knowledge of the coastal ocean and sea ice in Nunatsiavut using his method, which involves mapping and interviews, expanded to include questions around the physical environment, not just where people travel. And I want to mention Brianna Bishop, who's a student that worked on this, starting as a master's and later as a PhD. She worked with me from 2018 until within the last year she graduated with her PhD. So she's been working with me for a long time. So the method here includes large immersive maps. You can see very large maps, 10 to 20 feet square. And they're printed out, placed on the floor, and people from the community are invited to come in, walk on the maps in their sock feet. And if anyone would like to participate, there are Sharpie markers, and they can mark down their travel routes and associated information on ice conditions, ocean currents, important places, any changes of those properties that they would like to note. And in addition to the mapping, there are semi-structured interviews that go along with the maps. And so we get additional data beyond just mapped information. Those interviews include stories and history and changes and connections to culture as well. So the map domains were created. You can see the large map on the left. Each of the colored boxes are the domains for the maps for each of the communities. And it was informed based on existing knowledge about the footprint, if you will, of each community on the land that was drawn from, for example, our footprints are everywhere and other knowledge studies in the region. So we wanted to capture the area around each community that people use. If you look on a map, you see 5 dots, but people will actually use quite a large area around each community. Well, you can see there's really continuous connectivity of use all along the coast, even though typical map will show 5 dots. The maps that people created are scanned, digitized, and georeferenced, and the interviews are transcribed, coded, and used to link with the maps. These are some photos of that process. So some of the actual maps you can see on the left where people have marked different trails. Some, it says, stop to check out the rattle. This is an area of open water in the sea ice. So there's all kinds of contextual information in addition to just travel there.
I need to ask a question.
Yeah.
Here. Sorry. I'm just wondering, with the 5 different communities, did you travel to 5 communities and were you able to get representation from all?
Yes, yes. So each community was mapped in that community.
Okay.
So Rigolet and Hopedale were done over 2 weeks in 2019. And then we wanted to do it the next year, but 2020 happened. So we went back to the other 3 communities over 3 weeks. So that, yeah, it was done in each community, a whole week per community. Here you can see a group, 3 individuals mapping at the same time. And an important component that arose from this is that oftentimes people would discuss quite a bit before putting a pen to paper. So there was a process of community validation before anything was actually put down and recorded. And another important component of this was we didn't want it to just be documenting and extracting. but to be open to the community. And so anyone, even people not formally participating, so doing the mapping, were invited to be present and open to the community. So for example, here on the top right, only one person is formally a participant, and there's 4 people in the image, and there's 3 generations of people participating in the discussion. And so we wanted to integrate this into a process of intergenerational knowledge transfer, essentially. And here at the bottom, we have a visit from a school group exploring the map. This is an example from one of the communities. So this is the community of Rigolet. You can see all kinds of features. This is after digitizing and putting it in a GIS platform. So you can see all kinds of features. The blue area, the big blue area here and a little one here, that's the area that is open water year round. The black line is the edge of the ice. Everything that's not mapped blue implicitly is covered in ice during the ice season. The gray area would be areas that are unsafe ice, so areas that are thin. And then the lines indicate, blue lines indicate ocean currents with a qualitative measure of weak, medium, or strong, ocean current direction. And then the green and yellow would be travel routes, either by boat in the open water season or by sled. Could be traditional dog team routes and today's snowmobile routes. And this here is an example of the prediction of ice cover from a scientific numerical model. And we've actually started using the ice cover from the mapped Inuit Knowledge to compare against the model to check to see how well our model is doing. We're actually predicting ice in the air in the places that it should be based on what local people know. Because the knowledge that has been mapped here is at a scale for which we don't have scientific information. One of the things that came up during the mapping, we would always ask people, how would you like the results to be returned to the community? And different things were raised, but one was people noted that because of changing lifestyles, more and more people are working 9 to 5 jobs, Monday to Friday jobs in community. There's less opportunity for multiple generations to be together out on the land and exchanging that knowledge across generations by practice. People do it as much as they can, but there's less opportunity than there has been historically. So some people asked, well, it'd be nice if these maps were available in some sort of a booklet locally so that people could look at them together over the table in their cabins or in their homes. So we sought additional funding from Neopar for knowledge mobilization funding to develop these atlas-style booklets. I meant to bring one, I forgot. So the large maps are basically divided up into a dozen or 20 or so small boxes, each on its own page. And so you can flip through these booklets and get a zoomed in view of the maps, and they're interspersed with quotes that were provided during the interviews, usually focused on travel safety. So we produced these on weatherproof paper so people can take them while they're traveling. And we printed off 1,000 booklets and disseminated them in community. And it's been a really nice outcome of the project that's different from a typical scientific output. We wouldn't have thought to do, academically wouldn't think to do this, but it's what people asked of us while we were there, and we could find the funding to do it. Something else that arose during the mapping and interviews, especially in the community of Makkovik, was a very clear expression of, very clear expression of how people understood the seasonal cycle of the ice to function. What drives ice growth and melt? Under what conditions does it form, and under what conditions does it melt or grow more easily or more difficult? What's the role of the adjacent ocean, wind and waves, and so on? And it was academically interpreted like this is an expression of a conceptual model for the coastal landfast sea ice. And so Brianna returned to the community of Makkovik and explained to them how we had seen that model expressed in their interviews, and would they like us to pursue developing, sort of formalizing that into some sort of a conceptual model. And they said yes, they would like that. And so we worked with them over a few years. And Brianna developed this sort of visual representation of the conceptual model. So from top to bottom is time, different stages through the season, starting in early fall down to spring. So that will be the seasons during which there's sea ice. And the left column, the bluish panels, are how the ice system functions during a colder season, which is more common historically. And then the right set of panels would be how that ice system functions during a warmer season, which is becoming more and more frequent today. I'll just zoom in on this one portion of it so we can get an idea. This is the kind of information, and I want to just reiterate that all of this came from what people shared during interviews and mapping. This is not drawing from scientific literature or anything. This is a conceptual model that arose from Inuit knowledge and an understanding of the ice system. So for example, in a cool season here in fall time, cold temperatures, when cold temperatures occur for several days, you see this vapor forming over the ice, which is an indicator of ice forming. And after a few days, the ice will begin to form this early salt ice that's very flexible. Usually, so historically, you would get snowfall around this time. The snow would sink the ice because of its weight. That then floods the surface of the ice with seawater, but because it's cold, that then refreezes and thickens the ice. And this is the traditional way which the ice is formed and becomes a stable platform on which you can travel. You can see the presence of the snowmobile here in fall. I mean, traditionally, November, December, people would be able to travel on the ice. Under the more recent warmer type conditions, it's milder and it's later and harder for the ice to form. So in that early part of the season, it doesn't form very easily. And because it's warmer, when the snow does fall on it, it does flood the ice, but it's not cold enough to refreeze it. So you have this delayed ice formation, poor quality ice. It's very slushy, and it delays people's ability to access the ice. So we don't have travel as you explicitly represented in this model. And Brianna has drawn out all the different indicators of ice growth and ice melt and ice formation into this network diagram that you can sort of trace through and see, what causes in how local people would express it, what's good or what's bad for the ice, what helps ice form and stay thick and stable, what causes it to not form well or to melt early. And this is now something that we're talking about how we can interface with scientific understandings of the sea ice, because these components here are all what would show up as variables in a mathematical formulation of a sea ice model. But a mathematical formulation of a sea ice model would have all of the relationships. It would be very complex. We wouldn't necessarily know how to simplify it in order to make something useful. This is telling us what the leading order, like the most important processes should be, so we could actually make the right approximations and simplifications to a scientific model in accordance with what local people understand how the ice works. That was the first example of historical Inuit knowledge. I have an hour, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The second example is around contemporary Inuit observations. So this is the project that spun off of that Sustainable Nunatsiavut Futures project in 2021 called the Nunatsiavut Sea Ice Observer Program. This is the logo for the program that was created by our project coordinator, who's from Nunatsiavut actually. So this program, the tagline I have there, Inuit Know and Inuit Observe. So we talked about the Inuit Know part. Now the present day Inuit observations. The team here consists of myself, Emma Harrison, who's a research associate, not PDF actually, James Jock, who's from Postville in Nunatsiavut, who's a project coordinator, and Sue Ziegler, who I mentioned before. The four of us are what I call the admin team. And then we have the 6 observers on the project, Derek, Ron, Morris, Ross, Ruben, and Todd, one from each community. In Hopedale, we have 2 actually. So these are guys based in each of the communities who spend a lot of time traveling out on the land, are recognized in their communities as active knowledge holders. So the goal of this project is to preserve observations for future generations, enhance their use for environmental policymakers and researchers, and promote Inuit knowledge systems as central to understanding and responding to climate change. So how we do that is that Inuit knowledge holders, in this case, these 6 guys who are on the project, they make observations of the sea ice and other environmental and ecological conditions during the winter and spring ice season, so December to June is our time period, in their own words, from their own perspectives. So really, how they would, when someone comes back from a hunting trip or traveling to their cabin, traditionally people will talk to their community members and say, well, this is what I saw, this is what the conditions are like. Basically, we want to document that, not provide people with a prescriptive form, like what is the temperature, what is the wind. That would be fill in the scientific information box. We rather want to capture what's locally. What is the Inuit observing methods? What would that express? And so we've been doing this since 2021, I think. We have 4 seasons of data. This is an example of one observational record. So this is Reuben Flowers from Hopedale, 8th of January, 2024. They have hundreds of these records at this point, but this is what one looks like. People will submit text, sometimes photos or videos, maps. I'll just read it out. So both Aivitok Bay and Nunatsiavut Bay froze up quite fast and relatively uniform this year once it got cold. The last 2 years, it was different in that many holes were left open in the bays, and it took a long time for them to freeze over. It's a later freeze up this year than traditional, but it was fast, even though temps were above normal, which leads me to believe water temps must be lower. All the old harp seals left the bays last week on their southern migration just before freeze up. They knew this year there'd be no holes left for them to breathe and feed in. This too was in contrast to the last couple of years. So this single observation record contains in it what scientifically you would pull out as data points, dates of ice freeze up, temperatures, characterizing changes over time, how this year compared to previous years, hypotheses or understandings of how the system works, right? It's occurring at a certain time this year because of the water temperatures, connections to the ecosystem, so the observations of seals migrating, but also why they migrated at this time, how it's connected to the environmental conditions. And all these things are components that science would silo into these separate boxes. And as someone who tries to work across those disciplines, we can do it, but it's very hard sometimes to communicate across disciplines. We often sit in buildings that are 1 kilometer apart on a campus, right? Here, they're all expressed in one inseparable record. And this is the nature of these kinds of observations for which we now have the hundreds of records over 4 years. The governance of this project is really key. So I call us the admin team, and that's really how it feels. We don't feel so much like researchers. We have these annual general meetings. We had one in fall 23 in the community of Rigolet. There was one a year later that we had to cancel, but we had another one in past spring in Hopedale. At these meetings, we meet as a team, so all 6 of us, the admin team and the 6 observers. We have fun, we eat together, we try to get it on the land, and we discuss all of the goings on in the project. So we have defined the program values through these, and we revisit these every time we meet. We discuss how is the observation process going with the observers? How are we connecting with community? Do we want to connect with youth? Do we need to connect with elders? What should we do with the data? Who should have access to the data? How should we discuss this program within the research community, within the local Inuit communities? What program activities should we prioritize? And the outcomes from those meetings, or one of the outcomes, are these program priorities. So throughout the meetings, which typically take 2 or 3 days, we will highlight all the kinds of activities that are going on in the project, like what do with the data, how do we connect with elders, different ideas around that. And then at the end of the meeting, we all vote on what we feel are the most important things to do. And then so coming out of the meeting, we have a prioritized list of activities. And that gives us, the admin team, who can meet every week, because it's our job, we work at universities, we can sit on Zoom for hours a day, which is not what the observers want to be doing. We can meet every week and work on the project, progress the priorities of the project in a way that we know we're working on what the observers want us to do. It alleviates that pressure of like, oh, am I doing this for my job? Am I doing this for my own, my publication that's going to help me, or am I doing this for what is the priorities of the people I'm working with? It's been a good model to help guide us. So we're at a stage now where we're developing a website database that we hope to make public in a few months. So all the data is going to be public and searchable, and that decision was made collectively with the observers and with the Nunatsiavut government. So that's ethically we can do that. So we're really looking forward to making that public very soon. So people in community, researchers, educators can access it, and we network with other groups internationally that are doing this through this Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic organization. There are other individuals in Greenland, in Alaska, in Finland, in Russia that are doing similar things. And it's great to work with them through this organization because each of these groups are so locally and community based, it's actually hard to even know they exist without big overarching group organization like ILOCA to connect us. Okay, so the third example I want to go through is around scientific measurements of the environment. So this comes from 3 projects. There was a pilot project in 2018, which fed into the Sustainable Nunatsiavut Futures project. And then that's ending very soon. Really, we're out of money to keep doing the monitoring already. So this Goose Bay ice monitoring site, which started in 2024, is really carrying that forward. So, as I hope is clear at this point in my talk, Inuit know the sea ice. Sea ice is our highway for half the year. So we can use the sea ice to access the coastal ocean, and in doing so, make measurements of the ocean from that platform using local travel methods, relying on locals for safety and accessing places that are relevant locally. It also fills a scientific gap, both in time, because the ice covered season is the time period for which we don't have a lot of data oceanographically. Ocean science is typically done on large ships that don't deal well with coastal landfast ice. So the coastal zone and the winter and spring's time period are time periods where we don't have much data. So we have this community-based monitoring program where we use this method to access sites in the coastal ocean during the ice season to measure temperature and salinity. So salinity is the salt content of the ocean, using a typical oceanographic instrument called the CTD. You lower it down through the water, so it measures temperature and salinity all the way through the water column, from the top to the bottom, and also snow and ice thickness. The Inuit research coordinators that I mentioned, based in community, they undertake the field work with support from local experts to ensure that it's done safely, and also external researchers who travel in to join. So I've got photos of most of the Inuit research coordinators who've been involved in this over the years. So we select our sites by consultation with local decision makers like the Nunatsiavut government and the Inuit community governments, local knowledge holders who know their area, are interested in participating in the field work, scientists, and our research coordinators. And we take into consideration what existing work has been done, either by researchers or by local governments, that we could either complement or not want to duplicate. What are community values and interests? There may be certain bays that are really important for fishing or that people are concerned about for travel safety or significant changes. What's of scientific value and interest? Where is the novelty and significance that we can access scientifically? And then actually what's just feasible and safe? There are places that may fit all the other bills, but they're not going to be safe to do. So in doing that, we've identified several sites along 5 bays in Nunatsiavut that we have repeat data for. These are some photos of the field work. You see some days are beautiful spring days where you can work with no gloves on and no hat, wear sunglasses because it's too bright. And there's some days where you're hiding behind the Hummindig box because the wind is blowing 30 or 40 kilometers an hour and it's minus 25. But the basic method is to, at each site, clear the snow, measure the snow thickness, auger a hole through the ice, measure the ice thickness, then lower the CTD through the water column to measure the temperature and salinity that's recorded on the device itself, and then make qualitative measurements about ice and snow conditions and weather. And usually the locals who are familiar with the area are asked to provide that, and just how they might communicate it to themselves, amongst themselves. So we have, as I mentioned, 5. There's an additional one further north, but we've only done that one once. But we have 5 bays that we visit regularly, some more than others. So Nain Bay, Strathcona Run has had many seasons of surveys. Tikkoraluk Bay also has had many seasons of surveys. So it's a ton of data. At each bay, we have sites in a row down the center of the bay every few kilometers so that we can basically stitch it together and get an idea of what are the oceanographic conditions all the way along the bay. So this is what all that data looks like up to about 2024. So there's even more. That's what I look like trying to explain it. So rather than do that, it can be instructive just to pick one and think about one of the systems. So this is Tikkoraluk Bay, along the shores of which lies the community of Postville out here. You can divide this bay into an up the bay portion, it's about 12 kilometers long, and an out the bay portion, which is about 47 kilometers long. And they're separated here by what's called the 3 rapids, which is a polynya. So polynya is an area within the sea ice that never freezes. So it's a narrows and it is shallow like a sill, so it's a constriction. So the tidal currents are accelerated there, like in the Halifax Narrows. And so because the tidal currents are running so strong, it doesn't freeze. And this is a drone image of that area. You can see further out to the northeast and then behind the camera as well, there's ice cover, but immediately at that location, it's ice free. And there's a main river that comes in at the far end, farthest from the ocean. That opens out to the ocean, the northeastern end. Oops. So this is what that data looks like. So the way to read this is from left to right, is from all the way up close to the river end of the bay, and then all the way to the right is out towards the ocean. The 5 minutes left in our meeting. The top panel here shows the ice thickness along that line. So it's between 0.5 meter and 1 meter thick, except near that rapids where the ice is actually quite thin because of that those active currents that are thinning the ice. It's actually 0 right at the rapids, but we don't have data in the rapids because we can't get on it because there's no ice. I think the easiest panel to understand is the salinity panel. So bluer is fresher, yellower is saltier. You can see the influence of the river that comes out. So the vertical here is depth from the surface down to the bottom, about 100 meters. You can see the influence of the river with this big surface layer of fresh water that flows out the bay to the ocean, and then it's replaced at depth with inflow of saltier ocean water. And this is the estuarine circulation that we see in the system. Outflow along the top, inflow underneath. And that surface outflowing water is also slightly warmer than the rest of the water. I mean, warmer is relative, minus 0.4 degrees Celsius, but still it's a potential source of heat that could exchange with the ice that is immediately above it. And that raises questions around, well, what is the role of river input, fresh water, and the heat in the rivers? And the rivers are changing significantly under climate change. Precipitation patterns are changing, freeze and melt are changing. And so how does that change affect the surface flows and the surface heat that might affect the ice growth and melt? So this has informed the Tikkoraluk Bay ice monitoring site, where we ask, like, what are the physical processes most important in ice growth and melt locally? So we've set up this ice monitoring site led by my student May Wong, and we work with Morris Jock and Samantha Pilgrim in Postville, where we freeze a whole set of instruments into the ice in Tikkoraluk Bay that measure. There's a weather station, an ice mass balance apparatus, instruments that hang down into the water underneath to measure temperature and salinity, and really to measure all the things that we would need to do what's called a heat and energy balance in the ice. So that allows us to calculate, well, if the ice grows or melts, there's an exchange of mass and energy between the ice and either the air or the ocean. And we can track all of that and answer questions like, is it the exchange with the atmosphere? Is it warm air or cold air that's important for the ice? Is it exchange with the warm ocean that leads to melt in the spring? What's the role of fast or slow ocean currents? So we can track all those things and understand what are the important parts at setting ice thickness for travel safety. And then the next step would be, and we know they're going to change in such a way under climate change, so we can get a better idea of what to expect in the future. And I'm running up against the hour, so I will skip my example 4. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. We're almost at 1, but if there are any questions, maybe we can take one question. And I don't know, Sonia, have you seen any question from in the chat? No? No. Okay. Maybe we'll start here. I think you raised your hand first.
Yeah, I do have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just ask one of them right now. And it's going to be an annoying one because I'm sure you've heard this before. Okay, so I'm a historian. I'm imagining this kind of data you're collecting in, say, missionary records or explorers records or things like that. And I'm imagining Inuit talking about snow and ice and the language they're using. So the annoying part is, you know how that old thing about how the Inuit have a lot of different words for snow and ice, which I think is somewhat true, right? But is it helpful between the languages? Is it helpful to get data, or is that a data challenge in terms of translation? What language do you normally work with? You got French in the area too, sometimes in Hudson Bay. So just that's the kind of broad question I'm asking you in terms of how you name things when it comes to snow and ice.
Yep. So that's in the observer program that I mentioned. All of our observers are first language English speakers. People do mix a lot of Inuktitut terms in English today. Like even me, my father didn't speak Inuktitut, but there's names for things that I have. There's only an Inuktitut word for it, like complementary. There's not an English word for that. But the way that we approach that is let people say what they would say in whatever their language is, record it as is. They actually write it and provide it. And then if there are terms in there, we're actually building up a glossary, both an Inuktitut one and a Labrador English one, to define things like the words for ice or words for animals, not asking people to translate them, just actually following up and then defining them in a glossary. We haven't really encountered the translation issue, so we don't have an Inuktitut speaking observer, for example. But I can see what you're getting at. Like if we were to provide our observational record in English, the observation was provided in Inuktitut, and we translated it. There's going to
We could get better data potentially.
Yeah.
Potentially.
We'll take one question from the online audience.
Amazing lecture, thank you. I'm curious about gendered knowledge systems in different cultures. Is there a unique role for women in gathering observations or ways of knowing that are uniquely held by women in Nunavut cultural contexts?
Yeah, so our observers on the observer program, they're all men. And this is something we've started talking about, how to engage with that. And certainly the activities that men traditionally engage in, for example, hunting, there's some but not complete overlap with the activities that women would engage in, like gathering berries or gathering grass for crafts. And that presumably would involve different engagement with the environment and different kinds of observations would arise. So we're starting to talk about how we could incorporate that in the observer program, but we're early days. If whoever's asking the question has thoughts or guidance, it would be much appreciated.
Thank you for coming, Eric, and thank you everyone for attending the Black and Indigenous Speaker Series.